Hey, first grade! Welcome to Dunkin' Donuts. I hope that you don't get too hungry during this lesson. Okay, this might be harder than I thought. Let's take a peek at the computer screen to see what we will be making today. Before we get started with today's orders, let's review what we have learned the past few weeks. Partition, to divide shapes into equal parts. Here we have some shapes that have been divided into equal parts. The shapes we just saw are partitioned into different amounts of pieces. What do we know about how these shapes are partitioned? Well, we have some shapes that are partitioned into halves and some that are partitioned into fourths. Let's review what halves are first. Halves or half, to divide a shape into two equal parts. 2 is the key word or key number here, so when we're thinking about halves. Each shape that we partition into halves has 2 pieces, and we know that we can number our pieces to make sure we have the right amount. So we have 2 equal parts in halves. Now let's talk about fourths. Fourths, to divide a shape into 4 equal parts. And here the key word is 4, and we can see it in the number, but we can also see the word 4 in the word fourths. Each of these shapes are divided into fourths different ways. And again, we know we can number our pieces to make sure that we have 4 equal parts. Now, sometimes it's really tricky to do fourths because we might think we want to draw 4 lines, and then we'll accidentally have 5 pieces. So it's extremely important that we're checking our work and counting over our pieces to make sure that when we're partitioning fourths, we actually have 4 pieces. Now let's head back to the store to get our day started. It looks like Mr. Morrison is our first customer of the day. Let's see what he wants. I would like 1 whole donut, please. That word whole is in orange, and we know that a whole shape is one that has not been partitioned yet. So since it's just Mr. Morrison wanting a donut, he wants the whole thing. We don't have to partition a donut for one person. Okay, coming right up. Here's Mr. Morrison's donut. You're lucky, that was our last donut of the day. I would like a donut too, please, says Mrs. Johnson as she enters our Dunkin' Donut shop. Oh no. Alrighty, friends and first graders, do not worry because we can use our partitioning skills that we've been talking about to figure out how we can make Mr. Morrison happy and Mrs. Johnson happy, even though we only have 1 donut. So how can we use what we have learned about partitioning to solve this problem? We have 2 awesome first grade teachers who want 1 donut, but we only have 1. What can we do if we have 2 teachers? Mr. Morrison says we can share the last one. Phew, that was close. Since there are 2 people, we have to partition the donut in half. So since we have 2 people, we have to make sure that we have 2 parts for each of them. Alrighty, here's our donut, and we've partitioned it into halves, so Mr. Morrison can have 1 piece and Mrs. Johnson can have the other half. Phew, we solved the problem. I would like a donut too. Me too. Mrs. White and Mrs. Mitchell just joined our Dunkin' Donuts as well, and they all want donuts. Uh-oh. Don't panic. Alrighty, don't worry again. How can we make sure that each of our 4 first grade teachers gets a piece of donut? What can we do with our partitioning skills? There are now 4 customers, which means we need to partition the donut into fourths. So we have Mrs. White, Mrs. Johnson, Mrs. Mitchell, and Mr. Morrison, and they all want a piece of the donut. Since we have 4 teachers here, we have to partition fourths. Here's our partitioned donut into fourths. There's a piece for each of the teachers. We are problem solvers. I noticed the partition parts got smaller, though, when we partitioned fourths. So first, when we were looking at the donut, Mrs. Johnson and Mr. Morrison had half of the donut, and those pieces were way bigger, but now since there are 4 teachers, their pieces got smaller. Now we're going to compare the size of the pieces we partitioned today. And that word compares in pink because this is a word that you heard about yesterday during our literacy lessons. Comparing means we're going to look at 2 things and figure out what is alike and what is different. What do you notice about the size of these partitioned parts? What are you noticing about the halves and the fourths? How do they compare to each other? Well, when I look at it, I see that 1/2 is bigger than 1/4. So when we have halves, they are bigger pieces than 1/4. When we divide a shape into more equal parts, the parts get smaller. So as you can see, where we have our fourths, the parts got smaller than when we had our halves. We had to cut those halves again to get fourths, and it made our pieces smaller, just like we see in this picture. Which piece would you want to eat? Would you like to eat a half of a donut or a fourth of a donut? Why? Now that we've talked about how the pieces of the shape get smaller when we partition into more pieces, head over to Seesaw to complete today's activity. I can't wait to see the work that you do.